and again he laughed faintly. But his commanding officer was in revolt against the murderous stealthiness of methods and the atrocious callousness of complicities that seemed to taint the very source of men's deep emotions and noblest activities, to corrupt their imagination, which builds up the final conceptions of life and death. He suffered— The voice from the sofa interrupted the narrator. How well I can understand that in him. He bent forward slightly. Yes, I, too. Everything should be open, in love and war, open as the day, since both are the call of an ideal which it is so easy, so terribly easy, to degrade in the name of victory. He paused, then went on. I don't know that the commanding officer delved so deep as that into his feelings, but he did suffer from them, a sort of disenchanted sadness. It is possible, even, that he suspected himself of folly. Man is various. But he had no time for much introspection, because from the southwest a wall of fog had advanced upon his ship. Great convolutions of vapors flew over, swirling about masts and funnel, which looked as if they were beginning to melt. Then they vanished. The ship was stopped, all sounds ceased, and the very fog became motionless, growing denser, and as if solid in its amazing dumb immobility. The men at their stations lost sight of each other. Footsteps sounded stealthy. Rare voices, impersonal and remote, died out without resonance. A blind, white stillness took possession of the world. It looked, too, as if it would last for days. I don't mean to say that the fog did not vary a little in its density. Now and then it would thin out mysteriously, revealing to the men a more or less ghostly presentment of their ship. Several times the shadow of the coast itself swam darkly before their eyes through the fluctuating opaque brightness of the great white cloud clinging to the water. Taking advantage of these moments, the ship had been moved cautiously nearer the shore. It was useless to remain out in such thick weather. Her officers knew every nook and cranny of the coast along their beat. They thought that she would be much better in a certain cove. It wasn't a large place, just ample room for a ship to swing at her anchor. She would have an easier time of it till the fog lifted up. Slowly, with infinite caution and patience, they crept closer and closer, seeing no more of the cliffs than an evanescent dark loom with a narrow border of angry foam at its foot. At the moment of anchoring, the fog was so thick that for all they could see, they might have been 1,000 miles out in the open sea. Yet the shelter of the land could be felt. There was a peculiar quality in the stillness of the air, very faint, very elusive. The wash of the ripple against the encircling land reached their ears with mysterious, sudden pauses. The anchor dropped, the leads were laid in. The commanding officer went below into his cabin, but he had not been there very long when a voice outside his door requested his presence on deck. He thought to himself, what is it now? He felt some impatience at being called out again to face the wearisome fog. He found that it had thinned again a little and had taken on a gloomy hue from the dark cliffs which had no form, no outline, but asserted themselves as a curtain of shadows all round the ship, except in one bright spot, which was the entrance from the open sea. Several officers were looking that way from the bridge. The second in command met him with the breathlessly whispered information that there was another ship in the cove. She had been made out by several pairs of eyes only a couple of minutes before. She was lying at anchor very near the entrance, a mere vague blot on the fog's brightness. And the commanding officer, by staring in the direction pointed out to him by eager hands, ended by distinguishing it at last himself. Indubitably a vessel of some sort. "It's a wonder we didn't run slap into her when coming in," observed the second in command. "Send a boat on board before she vanishes," said the commanding officer. He surmised that this was a coaster. It could hardly be anything else. But another thought came into his head suddenly. "It is a wonder," he said to his second in command, who had rejoined him after sending the boat away. By that time both of them had been struck by the fact that the ship so suddenly discovered had not manifested her presence by ringing her bell. "We came in very quietly, that's true," concluded the younger officer. "But they must have heard our leadsman at least. We couldn't have passed her more than 50 yards off, the closest shave. They may even have made us out, since they were aware of something coming in. And the strange thing is that we never heard a sound from her. The fellows on board must have been holding their breath." "Aye," said the commanding officer thoughtfully. In due course the boarding boat returned, appearing suddenly alongside as though she had burrowed her way under the fog. The officer in charge came up to make his report, but the commanding officer didn't give him time to begin. He cried from a distance, "Coaster, isn't she?" "No, sir. A stranger, a neutral," was the answer. "No, really? Well, tell us all about it. What is she doing here?" The young man stated then that he had been told a long and complicated story of engine troubles, but it was plausible enough from a strictly professional point of view, and it had the usual features: disablement, dangerous drifting along the shore, weather more or less thick for days, fear of a gale, ultimately a resolve to go in and anchor anywhere on the coast, and so on. Fairly plausible. "Engines still disabled?" inquired the commanding officer. "No, sir. She has steam on them." The commanding officer took his second aside. "By Jove," he said, "you were right. They were holding their breaths as we passed them. They were." But the second in command had his doubts now. "A fog like this does muffle small sounds, sir," he remarked. "And what could his object be, after all?" "To sneak out unnoticed," answered the commanding officer. "Then why didn't he? He might have done it, you know. Not exactly unnoticed, perhaps. I don't suppose he could have slipped his cable without making some noise. Still, in a minute or so, he would have been lost to view, clean gone, before we could make him out fairly. Yet he didn't." They looked at each other. The commanding officer shook his head. Such suspicions as the one which had entered his head are not defended easily. He did not even state it openly. The boarding officer finished his report. The cargo of the ship was of a harmless and useful character. She was bound to an English port, papers and everything in perfect order, nothing suspicious to be detected anywhere. Then, passing to the men, he reported the crew on deck as the usual lot. Engineers of the well-known type, and very full of their achievement in repairing the engines. The mate surly, the master rather a fine specimen of a Northman, civil enough, but appeared to have been drinking, seemed to be recovering from a regular bout of it. I told him I couldn't give him permission to proceed. He said he wouldn't dare to move his ship her own length out in such weather as this, permission or no permission. I left a man on board, though. Quite right. The commanding officer, after communing with his suspicions for a time, called his second aside. What if she were the very ship which had been feeding some infernal submarine or other? He said in an undertone. The other started, then with conviction. She would get off scot-free. You couldn't prove it, sir. I want to look into it myself. From the report we've heard, I'm afraid you couldn't even make a case for reasonable suspicion, sir. I'll go on board all the same." He had made up his mind. Curiosity is the motive power of hatred and love. What did he expect to find? He could not have told anybody, not even himself. What he really expected to find there was the atmosphere of gratuitous treachery, which in his view nothing could excuse. For he thought that even a passion of unrighteousness for its own sake could not excuse that. But could he detect it, sniff it, taste it, receive some mysterious communication which would turn his invincible suspicions into a certitude strong enough to provoke action with all its risks? The master met him on the after-deck, looming up in the fog amongst the blurred shapes of the usual ship's fittings. He was a robust Northman, bearded and in the force of his age. A round leather cap fitted his head closely. His hands were rammed deep into the pockets of his short leather jacket. He kept them there while he explained that at sea he lived in the chart room, and led the way there, striding carelessly. Just before reaching the door under the bridge, he staggered a little, recovered himself, flung it open, and stood aside, leaning his shoulder as if involuntarily against the side of the house, and staring vaguely into the fog-filled space. But he followed the commanding officer at once, flung the door to, snapped on the electric light, and hastened to thrust his hands back into his pockets, as though afraid of being seized by them either in friendship or in hostility. The place was stuffy and hot. The usual chart rack overhead was full, and the chart on the table was kept unrolled by an empty cup standing on a saucer half full of some spilt dark liquid. A slightly nibbled biscuit reposed on the chronometer case. There were 2 settees, and one of them had been made up into a bed with a pillow and some blankets, which were now very much tumbled. The Northman let himself fall on it, his hands still in his pockets. "Well, here I am," he said, with a curious air of being surprised at the sound of his own voice. The commanding officer from the other settee observed the handsome, flushed face. Drops of fog hung on the yellow beard and mustaches of the Northman. The much darker eyebrows ran together in a puzzled frown, and suddenly he jumped up. "What I mean is that I don't know where I am. I really don't," he burst out with extreme earnestness. "Hang it all, I got turned around somehow. The fog has been after me for a week, more than a week, and then my engines broke down. I will tell you how it was." He burst out into loquacity. It was not hurried, but it was insistent. It was not continuous for all that. It was broken by the most queer, thoughtful pauses. Each of these pauses lasted no more than a couple of seconds, and each had the profundity of an endless meditation. When he began again, nothing betrayed in him the slightest consciousness of these intervals. There was the same fixed glance, the same unchanged earnestness of tone. He didn't know. Indeed, more than one of these pauses occurred in the middle of a sentence. The commanding officer listened to the tale. It struck him as more plausible than simple truth is in the habit of being, but that perhaps was prejudice. All the time the Northman was speaking, the commanding officer had been aware of an inward voice, a grave murmur in the depth of his very own self telling another tale, as if on purpose to keep alive in him his indignation and his anger with that baseness of greed or of mere outlook which lies often at the root of simple ideas. It was the story that had been already told to the boarding officer an hour or so before. The commanding officer nodded slightly at the Northman from time to time. The latter came to an end and turned his eyes away. He added, as an afterthought, "Wasn't it enough to drive a man out of his mind with worry? And it's my first voyage to this part, too, and the ship's my own.
Your officer has seen the papers. She isn't much, as you can see for yourself, just an old cargo boat. Bare living for my family."
He raised a big arm to point at a row of photographs plastering the bulkhead. The movement was ponderous, as if the arm had been made of lead. The commanding officer said carelessly, "You will be making a fortune yet for your family with this old ship."
"Yes, if I don't lose her," said the Northman gloomily. "I mean, out of this war," added the commanding officer. The Northman stared at him in a curiously unseeing and at the same time interested manner, as only eyes of a particular blue shade can stare. "And you wouldn't be angry at it," he said, "would you? You are too much of a gentleman. We didn't bring this on you, and suppose we sat down and cried, what good would that be? Let those cry who made the trouble," he concluded with energy. "Time's money, you say. Well, this time is money. Oh, isn't it?"
The commanding officer tried to keep under the feeling of immense disgust. He said to himself that it was unreasonable. Men were like that, moral cannibals feeding on each other's misfortunes. He said aloud, "You have made it perfectly plain how it is that you are here. Your logbook confirms you very minutely. Of course, a logbook may be cooked. Nothing easier." The Northman never moved a muscle. He was gazing at the floor. He seemed not to have heard. He raised his head after a while. "But you can't suspect me of anything," he muttered negligently. The commanding officer thought, why should he say this? Immediately afterwards, the man before him added, "My cargo is for an English port." His voice had turned husky for the moment. The commanding officer reflected, "That's true. There can be nothing. I can't suspect him. Yet why was he lying with steam up in this fog? And then, hearing us come in, why didn't he give some sign of life? Why? Could it be anything else but a guilty conscience? He could tell by the leadsman that this was a man of war." "Yes, why?" The commanding officer went on thinking. "Suppose I ask him and then watch his face. He will betray himself in some way. It's perfectly plain that the fellow has been drinking. Yes, he has been drinking, but he will have a lie ready all the same." The commanding officer was one of those men who are made morally and almost physically uncomfortable by the mere thought of having to beat down a lie. He shrank from the act in scorn and disgust, which were invincible because more temperamental than moral. So he went out on deck instead and had the crew mustered formally for his inspection. He found them very much what the report of the boarding officer had led him to expect, and from their answers to his questions he could discover no flaw in the logbook story. He dismissed them. His impression of them was a picked lot, have been promised a fistful of money each if this came off, all slightly anxious but not frightened, not a single one of them likely to give the show away. They don't feel in danger of their life. They know England and English ways too well. He felt alarmed at catching himself thinking as if his vaguest suspicions were turning into a certitude, for, indeed, there was no shadow of reason for his inferences. There was nothing to give away. He returned to the chart-room. The Northman had lingered behind there, and something subtly different in his bearing, more bold in his blue, glassy stare, induced the commanding officer to conclude that the fellow had snatched at the opportunity to take another swig at the bottle he must have had concealed somewhere. He noticed, too, that the Northman, on meeting his eyes, put on an elaborately surprised expression. At least it seemed elaborated. Nothing could be trusted, and the Englishman felt himself with astonishing conviction faced by an enormous lie, solid like a wall, with no way round to get at the truth, whose ugly, murderous face he seemed to see peeping over at him with a cynical grin.
"I dare say," he began suddenly, "you are wondering at my proceedings, though I am not detaining you, am I? You wouldn't dare to move in this fog." "I don't know where I am," the Northman ejaculated earnestly. "I really don't." He looked around as if the very chart-room fittings were strange to him. The commanding officer asked him whether he had not seen any unusual objects floating about while he was at sea. "Objects? What objects? We were groping blind in the fog for days." "We had a few clear intervals," said the commanding officer, "and I'll tell you what we have seen and the conclusion I've come to about it." He told him in a few words. He heard the sound of a sharp breath indrawn through closed teeth. The Northman, with his hand on the table, stood absolutely motionless and dumb. He stood as if thunderstruck. Then he produced a fatuous smile. Or at least so it appeared to the commanding officer. Was this significant or of no meaning whatever? He didn't know. He couldn't tell. All the truth had departed out of the world, as if drawn in, absorbed in this monstrous villainy this man was, or was not, guilty of. "Shooting's too good for people that conceive neutrality in this pretty way," remarked the commanding officer, after a silence. "Yes, yes, yes," the Northman assented hurriedly, then added an unexpected and dreamy voiced, "Perhaps." Was he pretending to be drunk, or only trying to appear sober? His glance was straight, but it was somewhat glazed. His lips outlined themselves firmly under his yellow mustache, but they twitched. Did they twitch? And why was he drooping like this in his attitude? "There is no perhaps about it," pronounced the commanding officer sternly. The Northman had straightened himself, and unexpectedly he looked stern too. "No, but what about the tempters? Better kill that lot off. There's about 4, 5, 6 million of them," he said grimly, but in a moment changed into a whining key. "But I had better hold my tongue. You have some suspicions." "No, I've no suspicions," declared the commanding officer. He never faltered. At that moment he had the certitude. The air of the chart-room was thick with guilt and falsehood, braving the discovery, defying simple right, common decency, all humanity of feeling, every scruple of conduct. The Northman drew a long breath. "Well, we know that you English are gentlemen, but let us speak the truth. Why should we love you so very much? You haven't done anything to be loved. We don't love the other people, of course. They haven't done anything for that either. A fellow comes along with a bag of gold. I haven't been in Rotterdam my last voyage for nothing." "You may be able to tell something interesting, then, to our people when you come into port," interjected the officer. "I might, but you keep some people in your pay at Rotterdam. Let them report. I am a neutral, am I not? Have you ever seen a poor man on one side and a bag of gold on the other? Of course, I couldn't be tempted. I haven't the nerve for it, really, I haven't. It's nothing to me. I am just talking openly for once." "Yes, and I am listening to you," said the commanding officer quietly. The Northman leaned forward over the table. "Now that I know you have no suspicions, I talk. You don't know what a poor man is. I do. I am poor myself. This old ship, she isn't much, and she is mortgaged, too. Bare living, no more. Of course, I wouldn't have the nerve. But a man who has nerve, see, the stuff he takes aboard looks like any other cargo. Packages, barrels, tins, copper tubes, what not. He doesn't see it work. It isn't real to him. But he sees the gold. That's real. Of course, nothing could induce me. I suffer from an internal disease. I would either go crazy from anxiety or take to drink or something. The risk is too great. Why, ruin. It should be death. The commanding officer got up after this curt declaration, which the other received with a hard stare, oddly combined with an uncertain smile. The officer's gorge rose at the atmosphere of murderous complicity which surrounded him, denser, more impenetrable, more acrid than the fog outside. "It's nothing to me," murmured the Northman, swaying visibly. "Of course not," assented the commanding officer, with a great effort to keep his voice calm and low. The certitude was strong within him. "But I am going to clear all you fellows off this coast at once, and I will begin with you. You must leave in half an hour." By that time the officer was walking along the deck with the Northman at his elbow. "What? In this fog?" the latter cried out huskily. "Yes, you will have to go in this fog." "But I don't know where I am. I really don't." The commanding officer turned round. A sort of fury possessed him. The eyes of the two men met. Those of the Northman expressed a profound amazement. "Oh, you don't know how to get out?" The commanding officer spoke with composure, but his heart was beating with anger and dread. "I will give you your course. Steer south by east, half east, for about 4 miles, and then you will be clear to haul to the eastward for your port. The weather will clear up before very long." "Must I? What could induce me? I haven't the nerve." "And yet you must go, unless you want to." "I don't want to," panted the Northman. "I've enough of it." The commanding officer got over the side. The Northman remained still, as if rooted to the deck. Before his boat reached his ship, the commanding officer heard the steamer beginning to pick up her anchor. Then, shadowy in the fog, she steamed out on the given course. "Yes," he said to his officers, "I let him go." The narrator bent forward towards the couch where no movement betrayed the presence of a living person. "Listen," he said forcibly. That course would lead the Northman straight on a deadly ledge of rock, and the commanding officer gave it to him. He steamed out, ran on it, and went down. So he had spoken the truth. He did not know where he was. But it proves nothing either way. It may have been the only truth in all his story, and yet he seems to have been driven out by a menacing stare, nothing more. He abandoned all pretense. "Yes, I gave that course to him. It seemed to me a supreme test. I believe... No, I don't believe. I don't know. At the time, I was certain. They all went down, and I don't know whether I have done stern retribution or murder. Whether I have added to the corpses that litter the bed of the unreadable sea the bodies of men completely innocent or basely guilty, I don't know. I shall never know." He rose. The woman on the couch got up and threw her arms round his neck. Her eyes put 2 gleams in the deep shadow of the room. She knew his passion for truth, his horror of deceit, his humanity. "Oh, my poor, poor—" "I shall never know," he repeated sternly, disengaged himself, pressed her hands to his lips, and went out. This concludes the reading of the tale. The reading of Prince Roman follows immediately. Events which happened 70 years ago are perhaps rather too far off to be dragged aptly into a mere conversation. Of course, the year 1831 is for us an historical date, one of these fatal years when, in the presence of the world's passive indignation and eloquent sympathies, we had once more to murmur, Ve victis, and count the cost in sorrow. Not that we were ever very good at calculating either, in prosperity or in adversity. That's a lesson we could never learn, to the great exasperation of our enemies, who have bestowed upon us the epithet of incorrigible. The speaker was of Polish nationality, that nationality not so much alive as surviving, which persists in thinking, breathing, speaking, hoping and suffering in its grave, railed in by a million of bayonets and triple-sealed with the seals of 3 great empires. The conversation was about aristocracy. How did this nowadays discredited subject come up? It is some years ago now, and the precise recollection has faded, but I remember that it was not considered practically as an ingredient in the social mixture, and I verily believed that we arrived at that subject through some exchange of ideas about patriotism, a somewhat discredited sentiment because the delicacy of our humanitarians regard it as a relic of barbarism. Yet neither the great Florentine painter, who closed his eyes in death thinking of his city, nor St. Francis, blessing with his last breath the town of Assisi, were barbarians. It requires a certain greatness of soul to interpret patriotism worthily, or else a sincerity of feeling denied to the vulgar refinement of modern thought, which cannot understand the august simplicity of a sentiment proceeding from the very nature of things and men. The aristocracy we were talking about was the very highest, the great families of Europe, not impoverished, not converted, not liberalized, the most distinctive and specialized class of all classes, for which even ambition itself does not exist among the usual incentives to activity and regulators of conduct. The undisputed right of leadership having passed away from them, we judged that their great fortunes, their cosmopolitanism brought about by wide alliances, their elevated station, in which there is so little to gain and so much to lose, must make their position difficult in times of political commotion or national upheaval. No longer born to command, which is the very essence of aristocracy, it becomes difficult for them to do aught else but hold aloof from the great movements of popular passion. We had reached that conclusion when the remark about far-off events was made and the date of 1831 mentioned, and the speaker continued. I don't mean to say that I knew Prince Roman at that remote time. I begin to feel pretty ancient, but I am not so ancient as that. In fact, Prince Roman was married the very year my father was born. It was in 1828. The 19th century was young yet, and the prince was even younger than the century, but I don't know exactly by how much. In any case, his was an early marriage. It was an ideal alliance from every point of view. The girl was young and beautiful, an orphan heiress of a great name and a great fortune. The prince, then an officer in the guards and distinguished amongst his fellows by something reserved and reflective in his character, had fallen headlong in love with her beauty, her charm, and the serious qualities of her mind and heart. He was a rather silent young man, but his glances, his bearing, his whole person expressed his absolute devotion to the woman of his choice, a devotion which she returned in her own frank and fascinating manner. The flame of this pure young passion promised to burn forever.
and for a season it lit up the dry, cynical atmosphere of the great world of St. Petersburg. The Emperor Nicholas himself, the grandfather of the present man, the one who died from the Crimean War, the last, perhaps, of the autocrats, with a mystical belief in the divine character of his mission, showed some interest in this pair of married lovers. It is true that Nicholas kept a watchful eye on all the doings of the great Polish nobles. The young people leading a life appropriate to their station were obviously wrapped up in each other, and society, fascinated by the sincerity of a feeling moving serenely among the artificialities of its anxious and fastidious agitation, watched them with benevolent indulgence and an amused tenderness. The marriage was the social event of 1828 in the capital. Just 40 years afterwards, I was staying in the country house of my mother's brother in our southern provinces. It was the dead of winter. The great lawn in front was as pure and smooth as an alpine snowfield, a white and feathery level sparkling under the sun as if sprinkled with diamond dust, declining gently to the lake, a long, sinuous piece of frozen water looking bluish and more solid than the earth. A cold, brilliant sun glided low above an undulating horizon of great folds of snow, in which the villages of Ukrainian peasants remained out of sight, like clusters of boats hidden in the hollows of a running sea, and everything was very still. I don't know now how I managed to escape at 11 o'clock in the morning from the schoolroom. I was a boy of 8. The little girl, my cousin, a few months younger than myself, though hereditarily more quick-tempered, was less adventurous. So I had escaped alone, and presently I found myself in the great stone-paved hall, warmed by a monumental stove of white tiles, a much more pleasant locality than the schoolroom, which, for some reason or other, perhaps hygienic, was always kept at a low temperature. We children were aware that there was a guest staying in the house. He had arrived the night before, just as we were being driven off to bed. We broke back through the line of beaters to rush and flatten our noses against the dark window panes, but we were too late to see him alight. We had only watched in a ruddy glare the big traveling carriage on sleigh runners, harnessed with 6 horses, a black mass against the snow, going off to the stables, preceded by a horseman carrying a blazing ball of tow and resin in an iron basket at the end of a long stick swung from his saddle bow. 2 stable boys had been sent out early in the afternoon along the snow tracks to meet the expected guest at dusk and light his way with these road torches. At that time, you must remember, there was not a single mile of railways in our southern provinces. My little cousin and I had no knowledge of trains and engines except from picture books, as of things rather vague, extremely remote, and not particularly interesting unless to grown-ups who traveled abroad. Our notion of princes, perhaps a little more precise, was mainly literary, and had a glamour reflected from the light of fairy tales, in which princes always appear young, charming, heroic, and fortunate. Yet, as well as any other children, we could draw a firm line between the real and the ideal. We knew that princes were historical personages, and there was some glamour in that fact, too. But what had driven me to roam cautiously over the house like an escaped prisoner was the hope of snatching an interview with a special friend of mine, the head forester, who generally came to make his report at that time of the day. I yearned for news of a certain wolf. You know, in a country where wolves are to be found,
Every winter almost brings forward an individual eminent by the audacity of his misdeeds, by his more perfect wolfishness, so to speak. I wanted to hear some new, thrilling tale of that wolf, perhaps the dramatic story of his death. But there was no one in the hall. Deceived in my hopes, I became suddenly very much depressed. Unable to slip back in triumph to my studies, I elected to stroll spiritlessly into the billiard room, where certainly I had no business. There was no one there either, and I felt very lost and desolate under its high ceiling, all alone with the massive English billiard table, which seemed in heavy rectilinear silence to disapprove of that small boy's intrusion. As I began to think of retreat, I heard footsteps in the adjoining drawing-room, and before I could turn tail and flee, my uncle and his guest appeared in the doorway. To run away after having been seen would have been highly improper, so I stood my ground. My uncle looked surprised to see me. The guest by his side was a spare man, of average stature, buttoned up in a black frock coat, and holding himself very erect, with a stiffly soldier-like carriage. From the folds of a soft white cambric neckcloth peeped the points of a collar close against each shaven cheek. A few wisps of thin gray hair were brushed smoothly across the top of his bald head. His face, which must have been beautiful in its day, had preserved in age the harmonious simplicity of its lines. What amazed me was its even, almost death-like pallor. He seemed to me to be prodigiously old. A faint smile, a mere momentary alteration in the set of his thin lips, acknowledged my blushing confusion, and I became greatly interested to see him reach into the inside breast pocket of his coat. He extracted therefrom a lead pencil and a block of detachable pages, which he handed to my uncle with an almost imperceptible bow. I was very much astonished, but my uncle received it as a matter of course. He wrote something at which the other glanced and nodded slightly. A thin, wrinkled hand, the hand was older than the face, patted my cheek and then rested on my head lightly. An unringing voice, a voice as colorless as the face itself, issued from his sunken lips, while the eyes, dark and still, looked down at me kindly.